The deadliest weapon ancient humans ever made wasn't a spear. It wasn't a club. It wasn't even made of stone, wood, or metal at all. It was invisible, and it turned the smallest scratch into a guaranteed death sentence. For most of human history, our ancestors were badly outmatched by almost everything around them. No claws sharp enough to open thick hide. No fangs long enough to reach a vital artery. No raw speed to run down prey across open ground. Compared to the animals sharing their world, early humans were slow, soft, and dangerously easy to kill. Sharpened sticks helped. Fire-hardened wooden spears, some dating back roughly 300,000 years and recovered from a site called Schöningen in Germany, show real engineering, weighted and balanced almost like modern javelins, front-heavy in exactly the right place for accurate throwing. That's genuinely impressive design, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote down a single principle of physics. But a spear only works if you can actually land a solid, fatal hit, and against something the size of a buffalo, an elephant, or a giraffe, a single spear thrust rarely finished the job outright. Wounded animals could run for miles, charge back, kill the hunter who thought he'd already won. Humans needed something that didn't rely purely on brute force or a perfect, lethal strike. They needed a wound that kept killing long after the weapon itself had done its damage. Nobody knows the exact moment it happened, and it likely happened more than once, in more than one place, entirely independently. But somewhere along the way, an early human handling certain plants, insects, or animal substances noticed something unsettling. A small cut, unusual swelling, pain far worse than the injury should have caused. Maybe even watching an animal die slowly after being grazed by something covered in a particular residue. That observation, repeated enough times, turned into a discovery. Some substances found in nature weren't just irritating. They were lethal, even in tiny amounts, even from a wound that would otherwise have healed in days. And once that connection was made, even by accident, it was impossible to unmake. Someone, somewhere, deliberately smeared that same substance onto the tip of a weapon on purpose. Not because they understood biochemistry. Not because they knew anything about toxins attacking the nervous system or the bloodstream. Just because they'd seen it work, and they wanted their next hunt to work the exact same way. Before we get to poison specifically, it's worth mentioning the other contenders, because ancient humans genuinely did invent several clever ways to hit harder and farther. The otlotl, a simple spear-throwing lever, could launch a dart with dramatically more force and range than a human arm alone, essentially turning an ordinary throw into something closer to a small-scale catapult. The sling, little more than a leather pouch and 2 cords, could hurl a stone hard enough to crack bone or skull at real distance. Both of these were genuine leaps in physical weapon engineering, but both still ultimately depended on force, accuracy, and physical execution. A miss was still just a miss. A graze was still just a graze. None of that changed the fundamental math of the fight. Poison did. Some hunter-gatherer communities today still use a version of this exact same technology, and studying it tells us a lot about how ancient poison weapons likely worked. The San people of the Kalahari Desert, for example, use poison extracted from the larvae of a specific beetle, genus Diamphidia, applied carefully along the shaft just behind the arrowhead, never on the point itself, to avoid poisoning the hunter during preparation. The poison doesn't need to kill instantly. That's actually the clever part. A single dose, correctly applied, can kill an animal as large as a giraffe within a day or two, even though the arrow itself barely breaks the skin. The hunter doesn't need brute strength, a perfect shot placement, or a second attempt. They just need to land the graze, and then track the animal until the poison finishes what the weapon started. This flips the entire logic of weapon design on its head. A heavier club, a sharper blade, a more powerful bow, all of that still depends on the strength and skill of the person swinging or firing it. Poison doesn't care how hard you hit. It only cares whether you broke the skin at all. Preparing the poison itself was its own skill, passed down carefully and guarded closely. The larvae had to be collected at the right stage, processed correctly, and applied precisely, since too little wouldn't reliably kill and too much wasted a scarce, hard-won resource. Getting it wrong wasn't just inconvenient. It could mean a wounded animal escaping entirely, or worse, the hunter accidentally poisoning themselves during preparation. For a long time, this was mostly informed speculation, based on modern hunter-gatherer practices projected backward onto prehistoric behavior. Then, researchers examining artifacts from Border Cave, in South Africa, found something that changed the conversation entirely. Among tools dated to roughly 24,000 years old, archaeologists recovered a wooden applicator stick, the kind of object you'd use to carefully paint a substance onto something else, like the shaft of an arrow. Chemical residue analysis on that applicator revealed ricinoleic acid, a compound found in castor bean plants, and one of the key toxic ingredients still used in traditional poison arrow recipes by hunter-gatherer groups today. In other words, this wasn't a guess anymore. This was direct physical evidence that ancient humans were deliberately preparing poison for hunting weapons at least 24,000 years ago, using plant-based toxins prepared with enough precision and care to leave a specific chemical signature behind, still detectable tens of thousands of years later. That kind of chemical residue doesn't survive by accident. Someone had to process the castor beans correctly, combine them with the right materials, and apply the mixture with enough consistency and care that a usable trace remained on a wooden stick for 24,000 years, buried in a cave, waiting for a lab test nobody involved could possibly have imagined. Here's why poison earns that title over anything sharper, heavier, or more technologically impressive. Lethality, in most weapons, scales with force. A stronger arm swings a harder blow. A better designed spear penetrates deeper. But poison scales with something completely different. Knowledge. A tiny, barely there wound, one that wouldn't even need stitches by modern standards, becomes automatically fatal. The weapon doesn't need to be bigger, sharper, or more advanced to become dramatically more deadly. It just needs biochemistry riding along on its tip. That is an enormous multiplier on lethality, achieved without a single improvement to the physical weapon itself. It also solved the exact problem that limited earlier hunting. Suddenly, a single hunter with a small, lightweight, easily concealed weapon could safely bring down animals many times their own size and weight, without needing brute strength, a coordinated group ambush, or a flawless killing blow on the first strike. Think about what that actually meant for daily survival. A hunter who might have needed an entire group, hours of pursuit, and real physical danger to bring down large game could now, in theory, do it alone, at a distance, with far less personal risk. That's not a small tactical improvement. That's a complete rewrite of what one person, working alone, was capable of doing to survive. This isn't purely ancient history, either. Sand hunters in parts of the Kalahari still use versions of the same poison arrow technology today, essentially unchanged in principle from methods that may stretch back tens of thousands of years. The knowledge itself, which specific beetle larvae to use, exactly where along the shaft to apply it, how long it takes to work, has been passed down, generation after generation, the same way survival knowledge always has, long before anyone wrote any of it down. And this same basic idea shows up independently, again and again, in completely unrelated parts of the world. Indigenous hunters across parts of South America developed curare, a plant-based poison used on blow darts, capable of paralyzing prey almost instantly. In Southeast Asia, hunters used sap from the upas tree, sometimes called ipo, on darts fired from blowpipes, another completely independent discovery of the exact same underlying trick. Different continents, different plants, different cultures who never met each other. The same accidental discovery, apparently, over and over again. Researchers studying these communities today aren't just documenting an interesting cultural practice. They're essentially watching a living demonstration of a technology that likely predates written history by tens of thousands of years, still functioning exactly as intended. Here's the part that should genuinely change how you think about ancient technology. When people picture prehistoric weapons, they usually picture sharper stone, heavier clubs, bigger spears, physical engineering problems solved with physical engineering solutions. But the single deadliest weapon ancient humans ever produced wasn't a triumph of physical engineering at all. It was a triumph of observation. Someone noticed a pattern in nature, connected an unsettling coincidence to a repeatable cause, and turned that fragile piece of biological knowledge into the most lethal tool early humans possessed, all without smelting a single piece of metal or grinding a sharper edge. In a strange way, it's one of the earliest examples of applied chemistry in human history, discovered by trial, error, and a healthy amount of accidental pain, centuries before anyone had a word for chemistry, biology, or toxicology at all. Nobody involved was trying to invent pharmacology. They were trying to eat that week. The science came entirely by accident, riding along behind a far more urgent, far more human problem. This same basic principle, that a substance itself can be more dangerous than any physical weapon delivering it, echoes forward through the rest of human history in ways that are honestly a little unsettling. Poison blades and weapons show up across many later cultures. Chemical weapons in modern warfare follow the exact same underlying logic, just with vastly more sophisticated delivery systems. And on the flip side, that same instinct, carefully studying which natural substances affect the human body and how, eventually became the foundation of medicine itself. Digitalis, a heart medication still used today, comes from the foxglove plant, a substance toxic enough in raw form to stop a heart entirely. Curare itself, the same blow dart poison used to paralyze prey, was later studied and refined into muscle relaxants still used safely in modern surgery every single day. Many early pharmacological discoveries came from studying the exact same same toxic plants and compounds that once tipped hunting weapons, just aimed at healing instead of harming. The line between ancient poison and ancient medicine was, and still is, thinner than most people realize. Every modern conversation about the deadliest weapon in history tends to focus on scale, on explosions, on metal, on force. But long before any of that, ancient humans had already figured out the most efficient possible way to kill. Not through strength, not through size. Through a small amount of the right knowledge, applied precisely, to the tip of something you could carry in one hand. If you want more videos on the surprising, often accidental origins of ancient technology, subscribe, because this channel covers exactly this kind of story every week. And now I'm curious, out of every weapon in human history, ancient or modern, which one do you think deserves the title of deadliest? Let me know in the comments.